I don't have a seller page right now. First of all, you tell me the ideas, things that you want on your t-shirts. I design them, I show them to you, and if you're down with it, I will put them on Amazon and then I will send you the link.
Gotta do this. Alright, boys. Okay. Time.
Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of the introduction module. Today we're going to talk about a concept that is pretty integral to sit and goes and to tournament poker. So an inherent overarching issue we run into when playing sit and goes as 10,000 The chip leader has 2x the stack of second place. Players played, and another sit and go. Its model thinks lucrative, very consensus based on research and talking to other poker players. Because I know they're definitely not gospel. I know they're not 100% accurate, but similar to studying ICM in HRC or in ICMizer, what you're really focused on doing is big takeaways, really polishing the highly negative or past very plus EV plays out of your game. That's where you are really being rewarded for your study, and where you should focus your study, not so much on the details at the margins, because it's likely not that accurate to begin with. All right, so if ICM has so many weaknesses, why do we use it? Despite its weaknesses, ICM is still arguably the best, or the Malmuth-Harville model is arguably the best, most accurate model we have widely available at the moment. I do suspect with improved computing power, focus on poker theory, focus around especially tournaments, especially with so many super high rollers and just so much money in tournaments at the high stakes today, that we will see some widespread new model be released at some point. My guess in the next like 5 years, 10 years. But yeah, the Malmuth-Harville model is the best thing we have right now. It's the best thing that's publicly available, and I don't see that changing anytime in the short-term future. But we'll see what happens down the road. It's more accurate than a linear, just chip EV model. And then finally, even with its many shortcomings, there's still a lot that can be learned from the Malmuth-Harville ICM model. As with models in general, I talked about this before. It isn't about getting the exact strategy output that a lot of solvers, for example, are giving us. What you really want to be focused on is looking for patterns across simulations, across solutions. I think a lot of people probably focus too much on the margins and what a hand that is close to 0 EV is doing. What you really want to be polishing out of your game is the big mistakes, the big plus EV plays that you're missing, and the big negative EV plays that you're making. Figure out common spots that they're coming up time and again. Basically, where your mistakes, these big mistakes are occurring frequently, and just get them out of your game. That's the goal. So because of something like that, and if you approach your study with that sort of mindset, there's still a lot that you can learn from this ICM model. Anyways, that's going to conclude today's lesson. And coming up in the future in Module 1, we're going to have a 2-part mini-series in the next 2 videos. We're going to talk a bit about the sit-and-go offerings that are available today online. And then we're going to talk in Part 2 about how, after you've chosen one of those formats that you'd like to pursue, how to go about like doing the research and figuring out who the winning players are in those games, what kind of win rates are attainable, talk about the variants that you're going to encounter along the way in that format, stuff like this. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I will see you guys next time. Hey everyone, welcome back. So today is going to be part 1 of a 2-part series on the different sit-and-go formats that are available online today. Part 1 is going to be more of an introduction to those formats. We're going to talk about the different characteristics or traits of each of those formats. We're going to talk about some of the strengths in terms of the goals that they correspond with. We're going to talk about some weaknesses of the format in terms of goals that you want to pursue. We're going to talk about the sort of ceilings that each format has in terms of stakes available. And then in part 2, we're going to take one of those formats and we're going to do an example analysis of the sort of work that I think you should be doing for whichever format you choose once you decide to dive into a certain game. We're going to look at how to go about researching the different win rates that seem to be available in those formats. We're going to look at a comparison of a bunch of different win rates for that format and what sort of variance to expect, what sort of bankroll we probably need. And then we are also going to look at the sort of effects of rakeback that are available on some of the major sites today, like PokerStars and Party Poker and WPN/ACR/Black Chip. And just sort of how they are going to affect our win rate, how they're going to affect whether we want to pursue more of a volume-heavy focus, or if we'd rather focus more pre-rakeback and just consider the rakeback a bit of a supplement to our win rate. And anyways, yeah, so that's what the plan is. Today, I think we should ask ourselves 2 sort of important questions before we start to dive into the actual specific sit-and-goes. In terms of, like, number 1, why do you want to play sit-and-goes in the first place? And 2, how will learning a sit-and-go format get you closer to your goals in poker? And I think that the answer to these questions is going to sort of lead you towards a specific format. And hopefully today's lesson is going to help in that regard. So I think these are sort of potential motivators or answers to those questions above. These are some of the most common ones. By no means is it an exhaustive list. I'm sure you've come up with some that I didn't put on this list. But building a bankroll is one for sure. I think sit and goes are great for that. There's still a lot of traffic in the low stakes games, especially right from like penny stakes to probably like $30. Basically, every format has reasonable traffic at those stakes. Improving your MTT game. Now, this is going to be more applicable to games like on-demands and 40. I don't even know 45 mans are actually format anymore, but on-demand sit and goes, $3 rebuy, 180 mans, stuff like that. These are like very good training grounds, and I've always said this when it comes to sit and go or to MTT improvement, just because every sit and go, every like multi-table sit and go is a bit of a mini tournament in itself. You have like all of the stages of a normal tournament. You have like the early deep stack play. You have the middling stack play or the middle game play where you're on like 30 to 40 big blinds on average. And then you start to get a bit more shallow. Stacks converge. You approach the bubble. You end up getting to the final table in the money. You end up getting heads up practice. You get just like MTT sit and goes are an amazing training ground for MTTs is what I'm trying to say. You can improve specific strategic elements of your game. Obviously, different formats are going to provide a different training ground for different stack size practice. So, for example, a lot of turbo sit and goes start 75 big blinds deep. And so the first level is 1020, the 1500 starting stacks. You have like 75 big blinds. The second level is 1530. Where you have 50 big blinds. There's a lot of that 50 to 75 big blind play in every sit and go, so you get a lot of reps in. And you can like really hone in on specific like weaknesses in your game. Maybe it's like defending the big blind at that stack depth. Maybe it's not 3-betting enough. Maybe it's 3-betting the wrong hands, et cetera, et cetera. You're just going to get a lot of reps in, as I noted there. And maybe your aspiration is to play sit and goes professionally or full time or similar to what I do. And if that's the case, then there are some limitations of certain formats and other formats that you're going to gravitate more naturally towards because they have a higher ceiling. And then another potential motivator might be that it's a sit and goes, or especially MTT sit and goes, are a lower variance alternative to MTTs. Or maybe you're just like short on time, and obviously a tournament can last for hours, and you just want to get in a few games, and you want a format that is similar to MTTs, so you decide that you're going to fire up some MTT sit and goes. And finally, maybe you just want to mix it up. You want to learn a new format, a new side game for your main game. Someone who I really look up to in this regard, or at least someone who I think that everyone should look up to in this regard, is Run It Once's own Daniel Devoris. He's someone who, over the years, has dabbled in pretty much every no-limit hold'em format I think that's been available online. And if I recall correctly, he's pretty much crushed all of those formats. And he's spoken a bit on the topic before, and has commented on how for him it was just a thing about it kept him like compelled and passionate about poker, and in general it's just a lot of fun to be learning a new game. I know even myself, while I don't have the breadth of experience as Daniel when it comes to trying different formats, I just know like when I moved to 6-max sit and goes, when I moved to 18-man sit and goes, etc., like those early months were the months that I was just hammering out volume. I was studying my ass off. It's just like it's so much fun to like dive into a new pool and just learn the game and try to like beat people at a game maybe they've been playing a lot longer than you. There's just that competitive edge that in me that just like wants to do stuff like that. So yeah, maybe that's your reason for starting sit and goes. All right, so now I am going to pull up I'm going to minimize the screen, and I am going to pull up this spreadsheet that I made. It's going to be available with the PDF that comes with this course, a link to this spreadsheet. But I just made a little like table here on some of the most popular formats of sit and goes that you're going to see online. And just tried to also have a couple of columns here at the bottom in terms of what goals the format aligns with, and some potential drawbacks of the format. So right off the top here, we have 6 Max Hypers as the first format listed. I think it is probably the format of sit and go that most people are familiar with if they have been in poker for a few years. It was by far the most popular format during the Stars Supernova Elite era when everyone was playing Stars Sit and Goes and trying to go for Supernova Elite, which offered something like 70% plus rakeback. Obviously, the speed available is hypers for 6 Max Hypers. There are 3 different formats: vanilla, just vanilla freeze out hyper, PKO, and SKO. So PKO is the progressive KO, and SKO is the super KO, where you get basically the equivalent. I think like half the buy-in goes to the prize pool, the other half goes to the bounty prize pool. If you knock someone out, you get the full value of the bounty for knocking that player out. They tend to start 25 big blinds deep, and the payout structure is 65-35. And the stake ceiling currently, talked to a few high stakes hyper guys, it's around $200. You do get the rare game that goes, $500 pops or 1K or something like that. But for the most part, 200s is where like the regular traffic sort of caps out. In terms of what goals are aligned with 6 Max Hypers, if you have professional aspirations, this is probably one of the formats you're looking at. Obviously, short stack play improvement. We're talking about a hyper and heads up improvement, especially short stack heads up play. Potential drawbacks of the format, variance, obviously. We're talking about some pretty big swings when it comes to hyper turbo sit and goes. On a site like PokerStars nowadays, you're going to need a lot of fun players or recreationals to be in that format to probably have a pre. Pre-rake back win rate. And even if you have a pre-rake back win rate in hypers, you're probably looking at like a low single digit. And as we will see in the next video, you're going to open yourself up to some pretty big swings as a result of that. I find it mentally demanding, or at least a lot of people do. The swings are just like a lot for human beings in general. While a lot of poker players do consider themselves, including myself, much less results oriented than the average population, there's still something about it being completely standard to lose over tens of thousands of games that is just a bit too much. And then another potential drawback of Six Max Hypers is that there are still a lot of longtime format experts that play in those games that still do well. So the learning curve is going to be relatively steep, and you're going to be against pretty stiff competition on average. The next format here is just Six Max, which is the format I focus on right now and have for the last few years. In terms of speed, you have turbos and reg speed games. Six Max only offers vanilla. There's no like KOs or anything like that in terms of Six Max games for turbo and reg speeds at least. You start with 75 big blinds in both formats, and the payout structure is 65-35. And then the stake ceiling currently is about $100. We're going to talk about that in a bit. In terms of what goals are aligned with this format, I think if you have professional aspirations, you can definitely still get by playing Six Max turbos and reg speeds. You're probably going to have to multi-site these days. And there are some games that pop higher than $100 for sure, just not regularly. And it's going to offer you an opportunity to improve your 50 to 75 big blind play, as all the tournament's first two levels, you're going to be playing that deep, and that's when ICM is going to be like the least restrictive. And you're going to get heads up a lot in a Six Max Turbo or reg speed, and you're going to get a lot of reps in at heads up play. And unlike hypers, you're actually going to be deeper sometimes. I've definitely played my fair share of reg speed Six Maxes where 50 minutes into the tournament, you're heads up with someone and you're playing an 80 big blind heads up game, and you have no idea what you're doing. So yeah, it offers that. Potential drawbacks of the Six Max format. As I mentioned, stake ceiling is about $100. There's an ever decreasing ceiling, it seems, in these games recently, in recent years, which is sad. PokerStars was the site that had the most Six Max games, and they somewhat randomly just completely took the $300 to $1K games off the site. So now you have $200 Six Max turbos, and then the next stake up is $2K. So there's, you don't have that ability to steadily move up, and you're only going to be playing the 2Ks and 5Ks if you're some sort of baller, and I'm not. Maybe you are though. And then also I have mentioned here an uncertain future, which, it also goes hand in hand with the ever decreasing ceiling. The third format I have listed here is another format I played for a few years, 18-man sit and goes. Today, the most popular 18-man sit and go is still the turbo, but there are some hypers and reg speeds out there on some sites. And the format is usually vanilla, but there are some super KOs. Starting stack tends to be 75 big blinds, and the payout structure is really the unique thing about 18-man sit and goes. It's incredibly flat. So 40% of the prize pool goes to first, 30% to second, 20 to third, 10 to fourth, obviously 0 on the bubble. But yeah, 40, 30, 20, 10, 0, super flat. You are pretty much always protecting a good chunk of equity, and there isn't really incentive to win those games. It's really all about sort of laddering, even when you get in the money. Another unique thing of 18-man sit and goes is that there are no stakes anymore offered above $30. So, you're super capped in terms of how high you can go in those games. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, depending on what your goals are. And we're going to talk about that in a second. So, goals aligned with 18-man sit and goes. I think they're an amazing game for building a bankroll. Highly recommend them in that regard. They also have sync breaks. So, if you want to, as I mentioned here, supplement them as an MTT side game, they have sync breaks every other hour. So, that's not too bad if you can, hold your going to the bathroom for an extra hour. It makes it kind of attractive. They're also 9-handed to start. So, you're playing. It's hard to mix in. I find it's hard to mix in 6-max games with, a bunch of tournaments. But it's a bit easier to do so with 18-mans because they are full ring. So I have potential low-hanging fruit as also a goal aligned with 18-man sit and goes. And when I say low-hanging fruit or potential low-hanging fruit, what I mean by that is I think that any sit and go format where the stake ceiling is relatively low is going to make that format a bit less attractive for like a good sit and go reg to play, or at least a good sit and go reg to play and stick around in and really focus on that format. And as a result of that, I think that the regs that are in those games are probably quite weak. And there's also probably, if they're still running, a decent number of fun players in those games. So my guess is that they're actually pretty lucrative considering all things considered. And even though the stake is low, my guess would be that you could still make like $2 to $3 a game in a $30 18-man sit and go, which is obviously, you got to fill those games up. It's a decent hourly. Potential drawback of an 18-man sit and go, as I mentioned off the top, it's a very unique ICM structure. It doesn't really lend itself to MTTs. MTTs tend to be more top heavy, so you're talking about a very different ICM structure, and if you're studying that ICM structure, I think it can lend itself to making some mistakes in tournaments. You might end up a bit too tight in spots, or maybe a bit too aggressive with a big stack when you're not allowed to be. So that's something to consider. And then, as I mentioned before, they do have a low ceiling. All right, so we've got the first 3 out of the way there. Now let's look at the last 3 I have here. So MTT sit and goes, I just sort of use this as an umbrella term to fit in a bunch of things. So when I say MTT sit and go, I'm referring to stuff like on demand, like 2,780-man players. I'm referring to like the 33 turbo bounty builders you see on PokerStars. I am referring to $3 rebuy 180-man sit and goes. So speeds for those games tend to be turbo and regular. There's no hyper on demands or anything like that. You have vanilla PKO and rebuy. There's no super KOs. Starting stack tends to be 50 to 75 big blinds. Payout structure is variable, but I will say that the payout structure tends to correlate pretty closely with your basic MTT payout structure in terms of being relatively top heavy. Stake ceilings around $100. You do see the odd 200 pop on ACR. In terms of what goals that MTT sit and goes align with, really good games for bankroll building, and especially amazing games for supplementing with your MTT grind or improving your MTT game, because these games are basically mini MTTs. You got multiple tables. You have starting with like 75 big blinds most of the time. And within like an hour and a half, you get the entire tournament complete. So you have this like MTT in a very condensed time frame where you're going to get to practice your deeper stack play, your re-steal stack play, your push fold, your ICM, your in the money play, your heads up play. Just amazing MTT training ground. And potential drawbacks, I have NA here for non-applicable. I couldn't actually come up with one. If you forced me to come up with one, I guess I would say something like it might be a little difficult to play them. Well, depending on the country you live in, they might be a bit more difficult to play professionally. I think that you would really have to work extremely hard and be playing on a site with good rake back like ACR to push close to 6 figures a year playing those games. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of benefits, and MTT sit and goes is one of like the formats that I would recommend playing for most people, especially if they come from an MTT background or they want to get good at MTTs. Okay. Next format here is a very niche format, double or nothings and 50-50s. Speeds offered, turbo, hyper, reg speed. It's a vanilla format. There's no PKOs anywhere. Starting stack is between 25 and 75 big blinds. Payout structure, very unique. In a double or nothing, half the field gets paid. The tournament ends. Both tournaments end, or both sit and goes end when half the field is eliminated. So usually it's between 6 and 10 players. So it's either like when there's 3 left or when there's 5 left, or some are 8-handed, so when 4 are left. But as soon as half the field's eliminated, the game ends. In a double or nothing, half the field gets basically double their buy-in minus the rake. And in a 50-50, you get your buy-in back, and then usually you start with 1,500 chips, and you get like a set amount of money back per 100 chips. So in a certain 50-50, let's say you cash, you have 2,700 chips when you get in the money, or when you cash, you get your buy-in back, and then you're going to get 27 times whatever that X dollar amount is right there. Stake ceiling, games seem to run regularly up to about $50. In terms of the goals aligned with the double or nothing format, I think they definitely satisfy the criteria for learning a new format. It's very niche, like I said. The games tend to be really good, especially on party, for supplementing a rakeback grind. One of the benefits of double or nothings is you don't have to worry about playing a lot of short-handed play, so 2-hand and 3-hand. And the reason why that's so good is because that's incredibly demanding. It feels like the action is constantly on you, and it's tough to get a lot of tables up. And then again, like I mentioned before, there is potential low-hanging fruit there. The stake's not that high, very niche format. Potential drawbacks of the format, in double or nothings especially, and this is the reason why stars went from double or nothings to 50-50s, is that there is the potential for collusion in double or nothings. If you think about it, if a bunch of people are playing in a double or nothing and they know each other, and they're on the bubble or something, they can soft play versus each other, and the person who they're not familiar with, they can make sure that that person bubbles, basically, almost a very high percentage of the time. So that is something to be cautious of if you do decide to take up double or nothings or 50-50s. But yeah, especially the double or nothing. And then finally, the last sit and go format that people still play, and I have no idea why. No, I'm just kidding. Sort of. Is 9-max sit and goes. So you have turbo, regs, and hyper speeds. The format is offered in a vanilla format, freeze out, or KO. I guess it'd be an SKO. Or maybe it's KO. There is a difference between an SKO and a KO. KO is just like a set amount. SKO is like you're literally getting like the full buy-in basically back if you knock someone out. Starting stack offered is between 25 and 75 big blinds, and the payout structure is 50-30-20, which is, you know, top heavy and similar to MTT structures, I guess, if it was like small field MTT. And stake ceiling, they tend to cap out in traffic around $50. In terms of goals aligned with, similar to a MTT sit and go, I think they are good training grounds for MTTs. That fact they're 9-handed and full ring means that the action's on you a bit less, so you can add some tables. Good for improving your MTT game. And then again, potential low-hanging fruit. I don't personally know anyone that still plays 9-max sit and goes full-time. I know some 6-max guys that add them when their tables are low. But yeah, I would assume that there's still some there is some low-hanging fruit out there these days, and that no one that is an absolute crusher is playing them full-time. And then finally, potential drawbacks for the 9-max format. In my opinion, lack of sync breaks. And that's what the MTT sit and goes have over 9-max, in my opinion, is that they do have sync breaks. And not having a sync break is just super unattractive to me. Makes it a lot more difficult to supplement with MTTs, even though you theoretically could. But yeah. And I do have one more slide here for you guys today to conclude the lesson. Just some other things to keep in mind when you are going about like trying to figure out what format to play. And then when you finally choose one, focus on one format. You do not want to be doing something like, oh, well, I want to play sit and goes, and I'm going to play 6-max turbos, and then I'm going to play some 18-mans on the side. No, don't do that. The ICM in those two formats is incredibly different, and it's going to make it very hard to study. It's going to really hinder your progress as a result. You just want to focus on one format. So pick something that aligns with your goals and do that. In the beginning, highly recommend shifting your play-study split. So if some of you are doing more of like an 80-20 or a 75-25 play to study right now, I highly recommend getting that closer to 50-50, at least for the next little bit. It's just really important that you hammer out the reps off the table, especially with the ICM calculator. And yeah, like I said, it's not going to be forever, but it's something that I highly encourage you to do right now. Put in the reps when it comes to volume, when it comes to study. Super important. You're going to be playing a lot of the same players over and over, so you want to get some hands on those players. And in addition, the more hands you're playing, the more you can get a feel for the spots that you aren't that confident in, and you can put work in off the table on those spots. This corresponds with the idea of putting in reps. Take notes, especially in the beginning when you don't have stats on people. Those notes are going to be huge. We're going to talk a bit about notes in a future lesson, but yeah, just believe me, when you start to play some sit and goes, definitely get pretty thorough with your notes, especially on the regulars. And then finally, don't make perfect the enemy of the good. Again, most important thing I think to remember is that ICM isn't perfect. So if you are beating yourself up for getting some calculations just a little bit wrong, maybe you're a pip or two off here or there, don't sweat it. What you really want to work on is avoiding those massive mistakes. And if you do make the massive mistake, what you want to do is sort of step away and try to understand exactly why you made that massive mistake, where the flaw in your thought process is. Really focus more big picture and not so much on the little things. Anyways, I think that's going to be it for this video. Again, this was part 1. Coming up in part 2, we're going to take one of the formats that we looked at today, and we are going to do a bit of a statistical analysis. We're going to take a look at how to go about doing that sort of thing for the format you ultimately choose to play, and just get a feel for the different win rates, how they affect our variance, how they affect the bankroll that we should have to be playing the game we choose, how rakeback is going to influence our win rate, etc., etc. So again, thanks for tuning in, and I will see you guys next time.
See you. Wait.
Hey everyone. So welcome back. Today is going to be part 2 of our little mini series within the first module on selecting a sit and go format. In the last lesson, we talked a bit about the different motivating sort of factors that go into why people might want to start playing sit and goes at this point. And in addition to that, we did a bit of a deep dive into 5 or 6 of the most popular sit and go formats that are available today. And we talked a bit about how the payout structures are structured in terms of what skill sets might get honed in each format. We talked a bit about how certain formats align better with certain goals and how certain formats don't. And today is going to be more of a supplemental lesson in the sense that this is the stuff that I recommend you do after you've selected a format that you'd like to pursue. So let's just get right into that. The first thing I think you should do I'd recommend doing, is getting a subscription to SharkScope and try to identify the biggest winners in a game you're looking to play. This is important in the sense of, it's good to know who the biggest winners in the games are. So for example, if you're going to pursue 6 max and you take a look at the SharkScope leaderboards, which are an indispensable resource, and you are seeing a lobby with 4 of the top regs on that leaderboard, you probably don't want to jump into that game when you aren't that well, versed in the ICM and whatnot. At the same time, I think it's just good to have an idea of who the best regs are, and you shouldn't be afraid of them at the table when you're playing with them or anything like that, but just be more mindful of, they've probably got a lot more experience in the format, and if you see them do something that you think might look a little wacky, maybe you should look into it a bit more and try to figure out under what conditions that would be good, because either, the reg isn't that good, which is absolutely possible, or maybe they have reasons for doing what they're doing. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why you want to know who the biggest winners are. And the second one would be, it's good to know how much those regs are beating the games for. So the attainable win rates in that format. This is also good from a point of view of, if the best regs aren't beating a game for very much, chances are that game, people are having trouble overcoming the rake. And in an event like that, maybe this is a format we want to sort of fade and should look to pursue a different format. Or maybe there's an opportunity there. And the second point here is to take advantage. I'd recommend taking advantage of SharkScope's alias feature. Really powerful feature. We're going to look at it a bit deeper on the next slide. But yeah, we should just actually pull that up right now. Down at the bottom left here, this is the link, sharkscope.com. So we're going to be operating today under the assumption that the person in question elected to pursue 6 max turbos and reg speeds. I think the reason for choosing to model it like this is obvious. These are the games I play, and therefore I can ensure the accuracy / validity of all the numbers we're going to talk about today. So as you can see, there's a few screenshots on the screen here. If we start top right, I created an alias of 6 of the best, in my belief, my experience, 6 of the best 6 max turbo and reg speed players on PokerStars right now, or in the last year or so. As you can see, you are in the advanced search tab here. You do need a subscription to use this advanced search feature. Again, I think it's something like $10 or less a month. So I searched for custom entrants of 6. The stakes we're going to look at are between $30 and $100. So that's going to encompass $30, $60, and $100 games. On PokerStars, we included reg speeds and turbos, and then we did our search for the last 4 years. Just allowed me to get a fairly big sample, while at the same time not including games so far back that they weren't really that relevant today. If we go top left here, this is what we ended up looking at. The 2 probably most useful features after you've searched for your alias is going to be the first tab, the graph tab here, and then the bottom right, the breakdown tab, where it's going to break down how the players are doing across every game, every specific buy-in. Going back to the top left here. So we ended up getting a sample of 60,000 games. Average stakes $48, does not include rake. So with rake, it becomes $52, I calculated. The rake ends up being about 7.1% on average. Average ROI of 7.5%. Turbo percent is 90%. Again, not many reg speeds run, but I did want to include them in the sample because players tend to play both. And then finally, I think the kind of the coolest, I guess, for lack of a better, more technical word, is this required bankroll category. And what that is telling us is the biggest downswing in raw dollars that this alias underwent over this entire 60,000 game sample. And again, this sample, these players had an average buy-in of about $52. So when you compare that to MTTs, where you can routinely go through ABIs of 1,000 ABIs, or downswings of 1,000 ABIs, this sample of players only had a max downswing of about 100 ABIs. And you have to remember that we elected to search for $30 to $100 games, so there is a decent gap between the lowest game we elected to search for and the highest. And when there's a big gap like that, like when the lowest stake is 3.5 times as small as the largest stake that we search for. The larger buy-ins do tend to have a bigger effect on stats like the required bankroll one, where if you go on like small to medium sized downswings at highest stake that you play, it's going to have a disproportionate effect on that required bankroll stat. So in reality, like if this player was exclusively playing $30 Singos or something with a 7.5% ROI, my guess would be that over 60,000 games, their biggest downswing they experienced would be more like 80 buy-ins. That's a guess, but in my experience, it tends to be true. So I'm pretty confident in that. One last thing I'd like to remark on about the images you're seeing on the screen is if we look at this graph feature here, the first thing that jumps out to me, obviously, is that it's a really nice graph. It's up and to the right, pretty steep slope. Don't see any extended downswings or break-even patches, really. I looked last night. I believe the biggest break-even stretch for this group of players over the sample was about 3,500 games, which is pretty small. But the one thing I would note is that if you look at the first 30,000 games here, this group's up about $130,000, $140,000. So they're making more than $4 a game over the first 30,000 games. Meanwhile, if you look at the most recent 30,000 games, the slope does decrease pretty dramatically, I think, and you have a net profit over that sample of probably more like $90,000 or $3 a game, which is a pretty big decrease in win rate, like 33%. And I would hazard that the most likely cause of that is games are getting tougher. Strategy in poker is progressing. Edges are getting a bit smaller. But, you know, it's still like if you're making $3 a game off of a $50 ABI, that's a 6% ROI, and that's still pretty damn decent in these games. So it is somewhat of a concerning trend over the last 30,000 games that the max achievable win rate has probably decreased, but there's still definitely enough money to be made out there to make the games worth playing. And yeah, I think that I hope that sort of conveys to you the usefulness of this alias feature in sort of being able to help us determine the sort of win rates that are still attainable in these games today. And with that win rate in mind, we're going to move on to the next step that I think you should be doing in your research. And that's to try to figure out the variance expectations for whatever format you chose. So my advice would be to use Prime Dope, which is formerly known as Poker Dope. It's a free website with a bunch of like really useful poker tools for exploring variance for cash games, tournaments, sit and goes, etc. It's going to help us get a better idea. So we're basically going to use our win rate and our sample size of games as inputs, and it's going to help us get an idea of things like our EV, the likelihood of losing money over sample games, the range of potential outcomes for different confidence intervals, and how much you can expect to win or lose if you run in the nth percentile of the sample. So if you are running in the bottom 5% of what you would expect to run over a sample, how much money are you expecting to make? If you run in the top 99th percentile, how much money are you expecting to make, et cetera, et cetera. And again, just like with the Shark Scope slide, we have a link down here on the bottom left to Prime Dope, the tournament calculator. And I'm going to pull up the actual website for you right now, just to give you an idea of how to go through this. So here is the tournament variance calculator at the link that I had at the bottom of the last slide. I've already run this, but so we just input the number of players here, how many people get paid, the buy-in. I did one just because I think that it makes it a bit easier to determine the numbers in buy-ins when you just have one buy-in equaling $1. The fee is going to be 0.071 because 7.1% was the break on 6 max turbos and reg speeds on average. The ROI I chose was 5, which is slightly lower than what we saw in the previous sample, but you know, I don't expect people are just going to be able to jump in the games and be beating the games for the highest attainable win rate of the best 6 regs. So I think this is reasonable. And then I did a 5,000 game sample, just randomly selected. If you're playing full-time, that's probably a couple months of play, turbos and reg speeds. If you're playing more part-time, maybe it's like half a year or something like that. And then sample size down here at the bottom, the default is 1,000. I did 100,000. Basically, the larger the sample size, the more accurate your results, but the longer it takes to calculate. This still only took like 14 seconds, I think. And if we scroll down here, we can see the distribution graph for all of the for 5,000 tournaments with a win rate of 5%. As you can see, there's only a very small percentile of the samples losing. So like unless you're running in the bottom 1 percentile, you're probably at least breaking even over 5,000 games with a 5% ROI in these games. And as you can see, like if you run in the top 10% in the 90 plus percentile, you're talking about making 400 plus buy-ins, which is pretty awesome. If you run in the 99th percentile, for example, you're making 514 buy-ins. Down here, we have 20 random samples. So basically out of that like 100,000 samples, it takes 20 randomly and puts them here. With the exception of this is going to be the best run. So the best case scenario was over 5,000 games, a player made almost 800 buy-ins. And the worst case, again, this is poker. We can't only focus on the positive. We have to acknowledge the negative. And the negative's pretty nasty. There's a player out there in this sample that had a true ROI of 5% and played 5,000 games and lost over 200 buy-ins. Pretty nasty. And this is probably by far the most useful tool or the most useful output that Prime Dope gives us. This just gives us a statistical table of data. So our EV over 5,000 games at a 5% ROI is to be up 268 buy-ins. Our standard deviation is $110. Going to explain that a bit more in a second. The odds of losing is 1%. So out of 100,000 samples where, 100,000 players played 5,000 games, only 774 or less than 1% actually experienced losses at the end of that sample. All right, and finally, this is going to be really important and tie in with standard deviation thing I noted above. But a 70% confidence interval is just like the likelihood. 70% of the time, you're going to run between X and Y in terms of buy-ins, with X being the worst case and being one standard deviation below average. And so, i.e. in this case, your EV is 268, standard deviation is 110. So 268 minus 110 is 158. And as we can see here, it's like 153, which is 3%. And then running one standard deviation above EV would have you with about a 7% ROI. A 95% confidence interval is going to be for 2 standard deviations above and below. And then finally, 3 standard deviations, which is going to encompass 99.7% of those 100,000 samples, is going to have you running plus or minus 3 standard deviations or plus or minus about 330 buy-ins of your EV. So again, it is possible within that 99.7%, it is possible to lose money over that 5,000 games. It's highly unlikely, but it is possible. And then obviously on the flip side of that, it sees you have an EV of 200 plus 268 buy-ins, but actually running and making plus 600 buy-ins over that sample. And one last thing to note here, what I did was create this little chart of 3 different win rates. We've already run the simulation in PokerDope for a 5% ROI. I also did it for 9% and 1%. Just to illustrate one thing in particular, you can look at this in your own time, but the biggest thing is that the 9% player has no chance of a loss over 5,000 games. The 5% player had a 1, but the 1% player had a 31% chance. And so my rule of thumb for sit and goes is that unless you're playing hypers, you really are making really good rakeback, you just don't want to be in the position where you are making a low single digit ROI pre-rakeback because your life's going to be hell. You're just going to lose so much. I don't think it's going to be very much fun unless you're a masochist. And yeah, I would just highly recommend your goal being in sit. If you're going to play sit and goes, that goal should be to not be a low single digit win rate player. And again, just to sort of build off of that point, this is the distribution graph from PokerDope of the 1% winner. And as you can see here, 30% of the samples are negative. And even, another 30% are winning less than 100 buy-ins over that 5,000 game sample. I hope that I've driven home the point that this is not who you want to be. So finally, we've talked about using SharkScope to identify the biggest winners in the game. We've talked about using Prime Dope to do some variance calculations for the attainable win rates that we observed via SharkScope of the biggest winners. Now we're going to talk about, as a sit and go player, one of my favorite topics in poker, and that's rakeback. So what is rakeback and what forms does it come in? Rakeback, quite simply, most of you are likely to already know, but some of you might not. Rakeback is basically the tournament fee that you pay for every sit and go, every tournament, every rake pot in a cash game. It's the site's way of giving back some of that fee to the players. So in terms of what forms it comes in, predominantly it comes in a cash form, which is great because you can do whatever you want with that. You can buy into more tournaments, you can withdraw it. Other times it comes in tournament dollars or tickets. And then another way sites give this rake back to the players is through promotions like leaderboards, for example. My advice would be that after you've chosen a format that you'd like to pursue, would be to compare a bunch of different sites' VIP programs. In general, if there's traffic on a site and they have a really attractive VIP program, and obviously if it's a safe site, it should be pretty high up there on your list of sites that you'd like to play on. Affiliates are another way of receiving rakeback. So basically, usually you need to not have an account on a site to be able to qualify as an affiliate, but some sites can tag players retrospectively or retroactively. Affiliates are basically just third-party sites that usually have some sort of agreement with the site where if people sign up through their link on their site, the poker site will give money to that third party, and that third party will make sure that you get some cut of it, usually between 5 and 15%. which is obviously nothing to sneeze at when, you know, a lot of base rakeback programs are somewhere like 20 to 30%, unless it's the absolute fucking joke of a rakeback program that Stars has now with chess, where it's actually something like 4%, I believe it was calculated. But yeah, like if you have a base rakeback of 20 or 30% and you're getting 10% from an affiliate, that's pretty substantial. And then finally, sit and go leaderboards and promotions on top of a solid VIP program. I have plus here. It's just a massive bonus. Again, if we're talking about a base rakeback plus affiliate rakeback plus rakeback you're getting from sit and go leaderboards and other promotions, we're starting to get into the upper echelons of 50+% rakeback, which is pretty massive, to be honest. But yeah, like based on all the above, I'd recommend like doing your research and then doing a bunch of spreadsheet work to determine exactly what sort of approach is incentivized with your sit and go format. Because, as I noted here, most rakeback programs are tiered, and there are going to be inflection points where you go from being incentivized to play maybe a lower volume and higher pre-rakeback win rate poker to playing a lot higher volume. You're going to give up some EV in the process, but because rakeback is so high, your hourly actually increases even though you're making significantly less. And on that note, I'm going to pull up a spreadsheet. So there are a lot of numbers on the screen in front of you here. Again, I'm going to invite you to look at most of those numbers on your own time. But the crux of what's happening here is that we're assuming that Hero has a pre-rakeback ROI of 5% when playing 6 to 8 tables and maxes out at around 1,900 games a month in 120 hours. If that player decides that they want to move from playing 6 to 8 tables to playing 10 to 12 tables, that pre-rakeback ROI plummets to 1%. It does allow them to get 3,000 games in a month in the same amount of time played, so about 1.6x the volume, with the obvious trade-off of a lot of that pre-rakeback win rate that they had playing less tables. So using the calculations that we looked at or we gleaned from SharkScope earlier, we had an average buy-in of $52, and the rake paid on average in each game was $3.71. I just created a kind of like model rakeback program here on the right. The base rakeback is going to be 20%, and it will go all the way up to 70% rakeback if you rake $10,000 in a month. So if we look at the chart here, we can see that the first few tiers here, 500, 1250, and 1850 games a month, that's all when the player is 6 to 8 tabling, and they have a 5% pre-rakeback ROI, and their EVs are over here. As you can see, they had a 5% pre-rakeback ROI, but if they end up getting up to the 1850 game limit, they're now collecting 40% rakeback, and their actual ROI is effectively close to 8%. So they've increased their ROI by 60% just via rakeback, and that results in 120 hours played each month and an hourly of $62.96, which, you know, for mid-stakes 6 max turbos and rake speeds is pretty legit, I think. And then finally, these final 3 tiers that we have listed here, these are the tiers where the player is going to be playing 10 to 12 tables with their 1% pre-rakeback win rate. But once they hit, so like they're collecting 40% rakeback, and we can see here that their hourly's gone down to 50, which is less than all of these first 3 tiers when you're playing less tables. But the catch is, if you can end up getting in this 3,000 games, getting above this $10,000 rake paid limit here, and collecting your 70% rakeback, what's going to happen is your net EV has now jumped. You're making $1,500 a month, but then you're making another almost $8,000 a month with rakeback as a result of that 70%. And your ROI actually, even though you have a 1% pre-rakeback ROI, with rakeback jumps up to 6%. And 6% over 3,000 games is going to be more attractive than 8% over 1,800 games of the same ABI. And we can see that this is what I would call an inflection point. So because you were able to get in, so you're playing the same number of hours, both ways, but because you were able to hit this rakeback tier, you were able to overcome the fact that your pre-rakeback win rate had plummeted by so much playing more tables. And then if we compare all of the above, so the first 3 rows were when we were 6 to 8 tabling, and these last 3 here are when we are 10 to 12 tabling with the 1% pre-rakeback ROI. We can see here in the first 2 tiers at the 2,000 games a month and 2,500 games a month, where we haven't yet hit that $10,000 raked limit where we'll get up to 70% rakeback. So we're still collecting 40% here. We can see our hourly is actually dropped. It's now less, playing more games, but at a greatly reduced pre-rakeback win rate. We're actually making less an hour. So we're still incentivized to be playing less tables and playing them better. However, if we do get over that $10,000 in raked in a month limit, we're going to jump up to 70% rakeback. And as we can see here, as a result of that, we're now getting about $8,000 a month in rakeback alone on top of our 1500 pre-rake back win rate, which ends up the player ends up having an EV, a monthly EV of $9,300. And even though they're playing the same number of hours as the player getting in 1,850 games a month, 6 to 8 tabling, that all that rake back is resulting in our hourly going up to $77.93. And when you compare that to the $62.96, that's an extra $15 an hour, or a 25% increase in our hourly, which is huge. That works out to $1,800 a month extra on top of, or $1,800 more a month, or 21 grand plus a year, which is obviously very substantial. And this is what I would call an inflection point. Basically, the inflection point, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is just when we go from being incentivized to playing this like more sound, higher win rate style with less tables to mass tabling, sort of. Again, if we look back to the previous slide where we did the prime dope stuff, we noted that with a 5% ROI, we had a 1% chance of losing over a 5,000 game sample. So even though we have a pre-rake back win rate of 1%, which would expose us to massive swings, because we've reached that threshold where we're getting 70% rake back now, and our actual ROI has jumped to about 6% over 3,000 games, we have sort of avoided that exposure that we would normally have to the giant swings, and it's going to make our graph a lot smoother with a lot less of that insane variance that you would see if you actually had a 1% win rate, which you don't actually in theory here, or in practice. And so, yeah, that's going to conclude today. Just like a quick recap. After you've chosen which sit and go format to pursue, I recommended 3 steps for sort of doing some background research. The first being shark scoping, figuring out who the biggest winners are in the game and what the attainable win rates are. Step 2 would be using prime dope and sort of experimenting with different win rates and trying to figure out like what sort of swings you're exposing yourself to in the format you want to play with different win rates. And finally, the third step would be to do a bunch of research around the different VIP programs available on different sites, and to break out a spreadsheet and sort of figure out what sort of approach is incentivized in the format you're playing with different volume. If you're going to be incentivized to play less tables with a higher pre-rake back win rate, or if you're going to be incentivized in the format on the site to play more tables at a lower pre-rake back win rate, but ultimately compensating for that and then some by making a bunch in rake back. So we have one more lesson to go in Module 1. That's the next lesson. It's going to sort of serve as a foundation for the rest of the course. It's on some basic theory concepts. I'm sure that will be reviewed for some of you, and it'll be new for others. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'm really looking forward to heading to Module 2. So I'll see you guys next time. Hey everyone, welcome to lesson number 6 of the first module, the introduction module of From the Ground Up Sit and Goes. This is going to be our last lesson of Module 1 before we move on to Module 2. It's arguably my favorite lesson of Module 1. I am someone who bases their strategy in GTO-oriented concepts. So I think that a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the more technical parts of the course that are coming up in future modules are rooted in the stuff we're going to discuss today. So I thought, for some of you, it'll be review. For others, it'll be an introduction. But I think that it is important that we touch on these things before we move forward. So the first thing we're going to talk about is equity. And we're going to talk about specifically the difference between equity and EV. So these are obviously two concepts that are, very important to poker. They are terms that are thrown around all over the place. But if I put a lot of you on the spot today and asked you to explain to me the difference, explain to me exactly what equity is and exactly what EV is and what the difference between the two are, how they're correlated, etc., I think that, it's not a super easy thing to actually delve into. It seems easy in your mind until you actually get put on the spot. So equity is just the fraction of the pot that a hand or range would be entitled to if the hand was checked down from the current node. It's expressed as a percentage, and an example of what equity is pretend ace-king offsuit gets all in pre-flop versus 2-2, and we're ignoring card removal and bunching. Ace-king offsuit has 47.04% equity. So let's say the pot is 10 big blinds, and we run this hand all in infinite times. In the end, ace-king offsuit is going to win 47.04% of that 10 big blind pot, or 4.704 big blinds. Now, EV, on the other hand, it's generally expressed either in chips or dollars, and it's the value of a hand or range calculated from the current node by summing the values of the hand at all future nodes multiplied by the frequency at which that node occurs. So obviously in poker, when you think about all the possible turn cards that can come and river cards that can come, this calculation is actually pretty massive. It assumes all money invested up until the current node is dead money, and thereby the EV of fold in the current node is always 0. Or if you are evaluating it through your current stack size or future stack size, etc., the EV of fold is just your current stack size. So I think the best way to view this, because calculations can be so massive in poker, is to actually view it from another sort of gambling-oriented concept or lens. And that is asking, what is the EV of a single roll of a 6-sided dice or 6-sided die? And the way you would figure out that answer is, again, you want to you sum the values of the hand at all future nodes, multiply the frequency at which that node occurs. So you take the values and you multiply by the frequency at which it occurs, the values being 1 through 6, and the frequency with which they occur when you roll the dice is obviously 1 over 6. So it's just 1 times 1 over 6 plus 2 times 1 over 6 plus et cetera, et cetera. And we end up getting that the EV, the expected value of a single roll of a 6-sided die, is 3.5. So usually equity and EV are fairly closely correlated in poker situations. So especially pre-flops, you look at a spot pre-flop, button opens, let's say they have pocket 6s, big blind defends, flop comes down, whatever. The button is going to have 60% equity, let's say, with their 6-6 across any like 3 random cards. And the EV in the pot for the button with that hand with 6-6 is going to be about 60% of the pot. Now, there are exceptions, and I'm going to show you a very extreme one. All right, so an extreme example here. We're going to look at a spot here, a nuts air versus bluff catcher spot, where the nuts air player is in the big blind and has a range of aces and then a bunch of these suited connector hands. So the range is 19 combos. They've got 6 combos of aces, so about 2/3 of the range is going to be bluffs. Our opponent, the person with the bluff catching range, has pocket kings. They have the bluff catching range because they lose the pocket aces, but they beat all the bluffs. And the flop here is going to be 2-2-2 rainbow. Starting pot is 50 chips. Effective stack is 650. Basically view this as 5 big blinds in the pot, 65 big blinds back. Both players are going to be able to bet pot on every street. If one player goes pot, 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 they're going to end up being all in on the river for pot. What I want to look at here, though, is I want to take a look at how much equity pocket kings actually has in this spot. So if we're looking at equity, which we are, we see that pocket kings has 70.5% equity. In a pot of 50, if they actually won their entire portion, just equity, the hand checks down or whatever, we see that pocket kings would win a substantial amount of this pot, almost 40 chips, right? That's 80%. So a little bit less than that. But in actuality, because of the fact that we still have 2 more streets to play after the flop, and we still have betting to happen or to occur on the flop, and because of the fact that the big blind has the nuts here, has the hand that beats pocket ace or pocket kings, it's able to do something called bluff stacking, which we're not going to talk about. Don't want to get too confusing and too advanced today. But because they can distribute their bluffs across streets, and because they can get 3 streets of value from pocket kings with their pocket aces, what actually happens is the imposition player in this spot has an EV of 0.9 from a pot of 50, which is they're winning less than 2% of the pot, despite the fact that on the flop, they have 70% equity, which is pretty wild. And which I'm sort of trying to illustrate the fact that while EV and equity are fairly closely correlated in an actual practice. In a spot like this, Nuts Air spot, it's way more important, way more important the composition of the ranges and how much the SPR, what the SPR is and how much stacks back. And the fact that the polarized player can sort of leverage the fact that there's so much stack back and they have the nuts. All right, so moving forward and getting a bit more advanced here from equity and EV, we're going to talk about Nash equilibrium. So Nash equilibrium is defined as a solution concept for games with 2 or more players or strategies where, first, all players are maximally exploiting each other simultaneously. So, I mean, I just want to stop there immediately and note that I think when a lot of people think of GTO or equilibrium, they think of just like these perfectly balanced range. No one's exploiting anyone, but the exact opposite is happening. All the players are maximally exploiting each other and winning as much money as possible. And no one player can deviate from his or her strategy to unilaterally increase their EV in the game whilst their opponents are playing their equilibrium strategies. There's no like, oh, I'm going to do this to try to encourage this deviation, et cetera, et cetera. If you have deviated from your equilibrium strategy and all of your opponents are playing their equilibrium strategies, one of 2 things occurred. One, you immediately are dominated by some other strategy that your opponent's playing, the equilibrium strategy, and you've lost EV in the game. Or 2, you've opened up the ability for one of your opponents to deviate from their equilibrium strategy to exploit your deviation. And like, that's it. All hands at Nash equilibrium are played in the highest EV manner possible. The reason I have this point on the screen is because a lot of PO grids we see have like hands mixing, a lot of hands mixing to various, like, so something's doing a hand like Queen is doing something that's about 40% of the time, another thing 30, and another thing 30. When that's happening, it's not because, I don't know, like the only reason that is ever happening is because the EVs of all of those actions are the same. That's the only time. You're always taking the action that has the highest EV when you're playing an equilibrium strategy. And the only time you would be doing multiple things with the same hand is if those EVs are the same. And then finally, there's no current equilibrium or GTO solution for no limit hold'em today that we are aware of. To actually solve for the GTO solution concept for no limit hold'em poker, 100 big blinds or less, requires a massive amount of computing power that we just don't have available to us. Maybe someday we will, but we don't right now. The best we do right now is basically solve these little toy games. Like, we put in our inputs, we put in ranges, we put in potential bet sizes. The actual like solution concept for no limit hold'em, you're going to have so many bet sizes being used in different spots and being balanced that it's just not possible for a human player. What we ultimately are doing are sort of solving these toy games to get a better idea of GTO concepts or GTO oriented concepts. So that is something that you should know. So future game simulation, or FGS, this isn't necessarily a theory concept, I guess, but it is something that is important for sit and goes. And it has to do with using solvers like ICMizer and Hold'em Resources Calculator. So it's a calculation that's used to help mitigate some of the inherent weaknesses of the ICM model that we discussed in a previous lesson by very roughly taking into account how future hands will play out, and then by taking into account how those hands will play out, we can solve for like a desirable or optimal-ish strategy for the current hand. Critically, FGS factors in where different stacks are located at the table, which is something that just like a single run of ICM does not do. And what's especially crucial about this is when there are short stacks present that are about to be in the blinds, that's going to like significantly influence the strategies of the players at the table. which we're going to see in a second. So here is our FGS example. Going to pull this up. So I just did a very basic hand. This is going to be a 6 max sit and go hand. So 65% of the prize pool goes to first, 35% to second. And we're on the direct bubble here. And the button in this hand, who's going to be in the big blind next hand, they have a stack of 2 big blinds. Small blind has a stack of 9, and big blind has a stack of 7. So if we run this hand at just a single ICM rotation or whatever, just for the current hand, we see the button jamming 34%, which is an important number to note. We see the small blind, if the button folds, jamming ATC. I think that should be super obvious. And the big blind calls 5.4%. So the big blind calls 7-7, ace, jack, king. But now we're going to do a couple hands of FGS, and we're going to see what that result looks like. And it is important to note in terms of like choosing how many future hands to go in the future. A spot like this, you can probably run like 4 or 5 hands. But what I want to do is emulate what's going to happen over one orbit after I fold. So i.e. I'm in the big blind now. I want to know what's going to happen next hand when I'm in the small blind, and then again when I'm in the button, and factor that in for what is supposed to happen this hand. It's embarrassing to admit, I used to do this incorrectly. So for 3 players, I would do an FGS of 3 to model an orbit. But that's not accurate because you have to think of the current hand as one like orbit, right? Or one, not orbit, but one calculation. So if I want to, next hand is one hand, right? I'm going to be in the small blind, and then another hand, I'm going to be in the button. And that's going to emulate the whole orbit because we're going to do the current hand right now. So I really want an FGS of 2 because that's doing 2 future hands, me in the small blind and me on the button. So again, just double checking. I did do FGS 2. You can see down here at the bottom. And okay, so now the button is jamming 41.5%, which does make sense. They are in the on the button, and they're going to be in the blinds next hand for half their stack and just going to have to call off any 2 cards. So it makes sense that they've expanded the range fairly considerably by about 20% plus to be able to jam something like this. And then we note that the big blind now is only calling 8-8 and ace king suited, and that might not look like a big difference, but that's 3.5% of hands, and this is 5.5% of hands. So that's a dramatic difference. And hands at the bottom here, like ace jack suited and ace king offsuit, that we're making, you know, a little bit of money here, 0.23, 0.16, they're actually dramatically losing now, 0.5 and 0.6. So hopefully that highlights for you the difference in potential results when we use FGS. So the last concept we're going to talk about, arguably the most important today, the most important that for the rest of the course, is this idea of minimum defense frequency. I'm sure some of you are familiar. I'm sure some of you are not. So let's just quickly go through this. An MDF is a game theory-oriented concept used to determine how much of their range a player must defend facing a bet size of B as a proportion of the pot or a fraction of the pot, to make villains' bluffs indifferent between betting and checking, assuming that checking has an EV of 0, which is important there to note. The MDF equation is just MDF is equal to 1 minus alpha, where alpha is the break-even bluffing threshold and is calculated by the equation of A, alpha, the break-even bluffing threshold, is equal to the bet divided by the bet plus 1, where B is the bet size represented as a fraction of the pot. So with these kind of things, it's good to work through an example. I would, appreciate if you guys would take this example, try to figure it out on yourself, try to get an answer, and then compare it to the solution that I'm going to give you on the next slide. So assume you're facing a river bet in a spot where your opponent has gone all in for 2x the pot with a super polarized range of nuts or air, and you are confident that you have enough potential bluffs in their range to exploit you. And you are confident that they have enough potential bluffs in their range to exploit you if you fold too often. How frequently must you call this bet in order to make your opponent indifferent between bluffing and checking/giving up? Assuming that, again, checking or giving up has 0 EV, they just lose all the hands in your range. So take a second, try to figure that out, and we're going to go through this answer now. So in terms of how to figure out this answer, it's going to be in 2 steps. So the first step, you determine villain's break-even bluffing threshold alpha for a 2x pot size bet. And the way you do this is to recall that alpha is equal to the bet divided by the bet plus 1. You just go through the math here, and you end up with 0.6667 continuous. In terms of quickly figuring this out, the way I view it in my head, if I'm facing a 2x pot size bet, I immediately view it as my opponent is risking 2 to win the pot, which is 1 plus their bet. So 3 total. So they're risking 2 to win 3, which means it needs to work 2 out of 3 times, or 67% of the time. So to figure out the MDF. So therefore, villain needs hero to fold 2/3 of the time for their bluffs to break even. And that's often the case when we're talking about these theory concepts. Our answer is often rooted through the perspective of our opponent, what they need to be to be doing to make something happen. So in an example like an MDF, we're looking at, and we're looking through our opponent's lens in that spot of how often they need to be bluffing to make us incentivize the call to make their bet break even. It has to do with the pot odds that we are receiving to make the call. So anyways, a little detour there. Solution continued. Step 2, we're going to solve for the hero's MDF. So recall that the MDF is equal to 1 minus alpha. Super easy, 1 minus the number we just calculated over there, and we end up with 33%. So therefore, facing a 2x pot size bet in the attempt to make their opponent indifferent between betting and checking, hero must defend 1/3 of the range facing this bet. And that's going to conclude Module 1, the introduction module of this course. When we see each other again, it's going to be the first video of the second module on early gameplay, i.e. 50 plus big blind play, early in sit and goes. We're not going to focus on exactly what's happening in hypers early game. But yeah, we're going to talk about the ranges I'm using in early and mid position. We're going to be talking about the things I'm looking at when I am playing in terms of the players behind me and what numbers I'm looking at in terms of their game that are going to incentivize me to start adjusting my ranges. We're going to talk about in what direction I'm going to expand my ranges, all that fun stuff. So yeah, thanks again, and I will see you guys next time.
He's smashed.
Hey everyone, welcome to lesson number 1 of module number 2 of this From the Ground Up Sit and Goes course. So in this lesson, in this module, we are going to be focused on 60 to 80 big blind play early in sit and goes, which tends to be the case for pretty much any sit and go that's not a hyper. This module is going to involve a lot of me talking, which, I like to do, and I think that you're going to get a lot out of it. It's basically my way of saying that we're not going to have a ton of calculations in this module, not relative to the rest of the course. And the sort of goal of this module for me is to get you guys thinking about poker in sort of a different way, sort of peeling away from this idea of hand charts. I know there's like a high demand for hand charts and stuff like that, but like getting away from memorizing hand charts and what to do in every spot, and to sort of get you thinking about poker in a way that is sort of based more on first principles, understanding why things are happening, what you're trying to accomplish at the table with different hands and different ranges, how you're constructing those ranges, why they're constructed in that manner. And to sort of be reacting to your surroundings more instead of just trying to play this generic style of just like, oh, well, I know that this is my range in the cutoff when it is folded to me, and this is what I'm going to do when there are 10 data points in front of you on the table that you could be looking at, which is going to result in you being incentivized to play a dramatically different raise first in range. So yeah, that's going to be a big part of this module. This idea of sort of cultivating how you think about poker and trying to encourage you to think about it in a way that I think is probably more efficient than how most of you are thinking about poker strategy nowadays. And the second part is that we're going to place a primary focus on pre-flop play in this module. And the reason for that is, one, because I find pre-flop strategy and what we should be doing a lot more knowable. Like, we have a lot more confidence in the results we've seen in solvers than we do in post-flop play, where it's a bit more dependent on inputs, bet sizes you gave it, ranges you gave a solver, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that a huge part of being a successful poker player in the long term, just being a good poker player, is I think it's underrated how important it is to have a good, solid pre-flop game. And I think there's a lot of like underrated reasons for this. One of them is that it just frees up mental space. If you feel that you know your pre-flop strategy or game plan like the back of your hand, it frees up a bunch of mental space. You have more confidence. There's less doubt in your game and more confidence. Obviously, they work hand in hand. And I think that a disciplined pre-flop game just naturally sort of protects you a bit post-flop. And when I say protects you, I mean mentally and actually EV-wise. I think that a lot of people, when they're trying to play, I think there's a lot of ego in poker. I don't think that's a bold claim or a hot take or something like that. And I think that people want to play really loose and aggressive and like a gangster or whatever. And they want to dominate their opponents. And I think that a lot of those people try to take hands that are on the fringe and not worth very much, or straight losing pre-flop as a VPIP. And try to force them positive and make something happen post-flop, take this really big bluff line or whatever. And they end up just spewing a lot of money, spewing a lot of EV. And I think that just having confidence in the pre-flop game you're executing prevents stuff like that. You just have a lot more confidence in knowing that your strategy is good, and you just play your hand normally post-flop. So those are the two focal points, I'd say, of this module. All right, so the first lesson of this module is going to be on low jack and hijack preflop strategies. Just a reminder, the hijack is the first position to the right of the cutoff. The low jack is the position to the right of the hijack. The reason that we are dealing with these positions is because I feel that there is an abundance of content out there online, free or for pay, courses that deal with full ring and 8-handed tables, and two positions that sort of get neglected, I feel, in all of that is the low jack and the hijack. There's a lot of content on how to play the blinds. There's a lot of content on how to play the button, how to play the cutoff, but there's a lot less on these two positions. So first principles, this is a term that I used in the beginning off the top. And it just basically has to deal with the foundations of whatever you're discussing, whatever topic it is. And so for us, what I'm asking is, what are we ultimately trying to accomplish at the poker table? This is something I want you to sit back and think about, like, what are we ultimately trying to accomplish when we sit down and play poker, when we are like taking actions and whatnot. And the way I would view it is that when we're playing poker, there's always a pot in the middle. And that pot, before anyone's done anything, is comprised of the mandatory bets, the big blind and the small blind in a no limit hold'em. And then in most tournaments and sit and goes, it also is comprised of the antes. So before anyone does anything at like an 8-handed table, a 6-handed table, there's usually somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5 big blinds in the pot. And what we are ultimately trying to do as poker players, and where our win rate ultimately comes from, is trying to win as big of a share of that pot, that like blinds and antes, that we can. And generally, when we're talking about the positions from EP to the button, generally we increase our win rate as we get closer to the button, because the button has the most inherent advantages, and it drops as we get further away from the button. Obviously, the blinds are special in that you are forced to put in a large bet without seeing your cards, and they're a bit separate from the other positions. But when we think about the low jack and the hijack, we know that at a 6-max table, these are two of, if we think of like the low jack, the hijack, the cutoff, and the button, these are the third and fourth probably most lucrative spots that you could be in at the table. What you're sort of doing when you decide to open from one of these positions, or what you're saying is that you have a hand that you feel is strong enough that you can open into 4 or 5 players, at least half of which are going to have position on you. And so with that in mind, as a result of that, we end up having to play a significantly tighter range than we do from the cutoff and the button. And therefore, we are entitled to generally a smaller share of the pot than the cutoff of the button. So before we get into talking about showing the RFI ranges that I recommend you play from the low jack and hijack and why, I want to sort of take what we talked about in the last slide about first principles and talk a bit about ICM and sort of my impression of how it's influencing the early stages of sit and goes, because it is different based on the sit and go we're playing. And basically I harped for a long time about how inherently flawed the ICM model is. And since I think that ICM is as flawed as it is, and we are now sort of adding complexity to the situation when we're talking about strategies for 60 to 80 big blinds deep, where people are playing such like dramatically different styles, and we just have even more uncertainty over the entire environment. I'm not spending time running 60 to 80 big blind deep ICM calcs. I am just sort of trying to get a general idea or feel for, I'm sort of taking into consideration the fact that I know that just playing strict chip EV can't be correct, while also taking the knowledge I have that I know for a fact that early in MTTs, for example, the ICM factor is actually very low. So therefore, I think, and I can sort of like confidently make the leap that early in an MTT sit and go, it's also probably not that strong and not that big of a deal. Like, I don't think you should be playing pure chip EV, but you can still do things fairly wide and fairly thin. I think a 6-max sit and go is a little bit different. So in a 6-max sit and go, if you think of early in one of those, everyone's on an even stack, so they end up having a decent amount of equity to protect, especially when you consider the fact that 33% of the field is paid. It's actually reasonably close to the money. So obviously, like, you want to beat the rake, and then there's some ICM, which is naturally going to result in us having to play a style that is a bit tighter than chip EV. On the flip side, I do think that there is, in terms of future game, there are arguments to be made that you can disregard ICM, or maybe like not disregard it, but consider that it has a bit less of an effect early in 6-max sit and goes, as a result of the fact that if you do find yourself doubling up early in one of those tournaments or building a big stack early, there's a really good chance you're going to find yourself with a chip lead or near chip lead on the bubble, which is an extremely lucrative spot to find yourself and where you're going to make a lot of money. So that's the case. In terms of like what exactly a heuristic is, it's effectively a shortcut or rule of thumb for a complex problem. It lacks accuracy, but it tends to be efficient. So it's basically like we're taking a bunch of things into consideration. We know that our answer isn't the exact answer, but we know that it's more precise than if we had just ignored this altogether. I talked a bit about early game ICM and 6max versus other formats. The heuristic itself that I use is that the more chips I invest in a pot early, the less willing I am to do so in a thin spot. And what I basically mean by this is simply that, and the reason that this is the case is that if I was playing a tournament with the 6max tournament with 5 other GTO bots or 5 GTO bots, I'm not saying I'm a GTO bot, and they're a bunch of good players, I'm going to be more willing to take a thin spot just because I'm not going, because like in that environment, it's not the same as the environment I'm actually going to be playing in, which is going to be an environment where there's at least 2 fun players at the table, maybe up to 4. And in a spot like that, chips are just naturally going to flow to me in spots they shouldn't. And so like the more uncertain I am about how profitable a spot is and for like the larger chunk of my stack that play is going to be, the more I'm likely going to pass that. So I get to the river in a spot where I don't have a really good read. You know, I bet 2 streets. I have like a pot size bet back. Get to the river in a spot where the turn sort of came a card that hit their continuing range on the flop decently hard, and I don't have a lot of confidence that they're now going to be able to fold like a strong second pair or a weak top pair or something that I feel they need to fold for me to make a profitable play. Due to like ICM and due to the fact that like sort of like for edge passing reasons and whatnot, and the fact that I think this play could be really bad, and because I'm going to pick up chips in future hands more easily than I should, and chips are going to flow to me in this tournament, and I have better ICM knowledge and better heads-up knowledge than these other players, I'm more likely to pass that spot than I would be in a game if I was playing as like 5 GTO bots or something like that. And that's basically the heuristic I use. And again, the more chips I invest in the pot early, the less willing I am to do so in a thin spot. So if I am going to be bluffing early for like my entire stack against some random, there's a good chance that I'm doing it because I am very confident that they're going to fold either more than they should, or because I have like amazing blockers and the bluff should be profitable in its own right. So these are the low jack and hijack ranges that I've sort of customly made. That I would recommend everyone use as like their baseline, their default starting point when it comes to raising first in from these positions, early in sit and goes. So if we look at the low jack range here, I mean, it's not like these ranges are super tight. We're talking about opening 21% from the low jack and 27% from the hijack. You're not going to be called a nit for doing this. But in terms of like why I've stripped out the hands I have and the hands at the bottom of the range, there's a bunch of reasons. One, a lot of the solver ranges that go around the internet are done strictly in chip EV. So they're not taking into account rake and they're not taking into account ICM. Another thing that's happening is that a lot of the hands at the very strictly in hands I have, we're talking about be confident that they're going to fold either more than they should, or because I have like amazing blockers and the bluff should be profitable in its own right. So these are the low jack and hijack ranges that I've sort of customly made that I would recommend everyone use as like their baseline, their default starting point when it comes to raising first in from these positions, early in sit and goes. So if we look at the low jack range here, I mean, it's not like these ranges are super tight. We're talking about opening 21% from the low jack and 27% from the hijack. You're not going to be called a nit for doing this. But in terms of like why I've stripped out the hands I have and the hands at the bottom of the range, there's a bunch of reasons. One, a lot of the solver ranges that go around the internet are done strictly in chip EV. So they're not taking into account rake and they're not taking into account ICM. Another thing that's happening is that a lot of the hands at the very bottom of those ranges aren't making any money. They are actually like dead break even. In theory, like equilibrium versus equilibrium. And like, yeah, sure, you might consider yourself a good poker player, but you're still making mistakes. You're still probably not able to drive that hand that is breaking even positive, especially when you're opening from the low jack and the hijack where there's still 4 or 5 people behind you, including half the table that's going to have position on you. In terms of the low jack range here, We should note that I've stripped out this offsuit Broadway region and the small pair region. Reason for that is basically just I think that people end up putting a bit too much money in the pot with that region. I think maybe these 2s and 3s, people end up either getting reverse implied, or they end up trying to use these hands and turn them into bluffs because they find them, consider them at like the bottom of their range. Or with the more likely with the offsuit Broadway region is you just get reverse implied. You run into hands that are like King Queen, King Jack, Ace 10. People just flop better top pairs than you, and there's just like this lack of awareness for how range versus range interaction looks on different textures, and people end up putting like an extra bet or two in when they shouldn't, or they just can't get away when they flop top pair. So just like not even opening them in the first place, hands that probably aren't that profitable to begin with, just sort of avoids that headache. Over here in the hijack, I didn't really strip that much from this range. That is probably shocking to you. When you look at it, you probably can't even guess which hands I took out. Something that I would like note is something that you should be paying attention to when you are talking about RFI ranges is you want to be keeping an eye on how the bottom of your ranges are performing. So, get a few 100,000 hands or 100,000 hands or something. Group some of these bottom of range opens together and just get an idea of how much you're winning. Ideally, that should be close to zero. Obviously, hands that are making close to zero are going to be quite swingy. So don't become too hyper-focused on a losing win rate with the bottom of range over 30,000 EP opens. But it's just something to keep an eye on. Sometimes you can realize it can be brought to your attention that you're actually losing significantly with a region that you weren't aware of. That happens pretty frequently, and I've definitely over the years sort of kept an eye on this sort of thing and had to definitely cut out some fringe hands, some different spots that I thought were good because the solver told me it was good and it just wasn't. Obviously, early game when we're talking about 60 to 80 big blinds deep, a lot more emphasis on having hands that can make the nuts than having high cards. So, for example, in the low jack, we're not opening like Ace 9 and Ace 8. Who cares about blockers and these offsuit Broadways? Our emphasis is more on making the nuts and having suited hands that have better playability. So hands like King 6 suited have priority over a hand like Queen Jack offsuit. Over here in the hijack, it's similar. We've got a bunch of hands like King 4 suited and 5-4 suited, and they're all getting in there before a hand like Ace 8-0 or Ace 7-0 or King 9-0 and stuff like that. So when we're deeper, playability is more important, and when we get shallower, blockers are more important. All right, so when we think of those ranges that we just saw on the previous page, let's think about some villain tendencies which encourage expansion, so allow us to steal a bit wider. And remember that any expansion we do in the low jack and hijack is probably going to be relatively modest, and that's just strictly the function of the fact that there's still a lot of people behind us. So villain folding more than they should be versus opens pre-flop, that's obviously a tendency which should encourage us to want to open a bit more. Villains 3-betting less than they should be pre-flop, and villains who 2-bet less than they should be on the flop. I said post-flop, but I explicitly meant the flop. All of these things are things that you probably or definitely need to have an idea of what the optimal frequency is before you can say that, oh, well, someone's folding too much pre-flop or someone's 3-betting less than they should be when I open the cutoff and the small blind, they fold the small blind. And when we look at these three things on the screen, again, take a second, pause the video, think about it. What's the common theme that you are seeing among these three things? So villain folding more than they should, villain 3-betting less than they should, villain 2-betting less than they should on the flop. What is sort of the common theme that's happening in all these spots, or what's going to be the result of that? And the answer to that, quite simply, is that all of those things allow Hero to realize more equity than they should, especially with the bottom of the range. If people are folding too much, if they're not denying us at the bottom of our then to be definitely cut out some fringe hands, some different spots that I thought were good because the solver told me it was good and it just wasn't. Obviously, early game when we're talking about 60 to 80 big blinds deep, a lot more emphasis on having hands that can make the nuts than having high cards. So, for example, in the low jack, we're not opening like Ace 9 and Ace 8. Who cares about blockers and these offsuit Broadways? our emphasis is more on making the nuts and having suited hands that have better playability. So hands like King 6 suited have priority over a hand like Queen Jack offsuit. Over here in the hijack, it's similar. We've got a bunch of hands like King 4 suited and 5-4 suited, and they're all getting in there before a hand like Ace 8-0 or Ace 7-0 or King 9-0 and stuff like that. So when we're deeper, playability is more important, and when we get shallower, blockers are more important. All right, so when we think of those ranges that we just saw on the previous page, let's think about some villain tendencies which encourage expansion, so allow us to steal a bit wider. And remember that any expansion we do in the low jack and hijack is probably going to be relatively modest, and that's just strictly the function of the fact that there's still a lot of people behind us. So villain folding more than they should be versus opens pre-flop, that's obviously a tendency which should encourage us to want to open a bit more. Villains 3-betting less than they should be pre-flop, and villains who 2-bet less than they should be on the flop.
Yeah, let me give it a shot.
I said post-flop, but I explicitly meant the flop. All of these things are things that you probably or definitely need to have an idea of like what the optimal frequency is before you can say that, oh, well, someone's folding too much pre-flop or someone's 3-betting less than they should be when I open the cutoff and the small blind, they fold the small blind. And when we look at these three things on the screen, again, take a second, pause the video, think about it. What's the common theme that you are seeing among these three things? So villain folding more than they should, villain 3-betting less than they should, villain 2-betting less than they should on the flop. What is like sort of the common theme that's happening in all these spots, or what's going to be the result of that? And the answer to that, quite simply, is that all of those things allow Hero to realize more equity than they should, especially at the bottom of the range. If people are folding too much, if they're not denying us at the bottom of our range equity in enough spots, that's going to result in us being able to play more hands profitably. So I have here with which hands do we expand and why. So if we just go back to this video. Sorry, if we just go back to this slide. So when we're early, we want to be able to make the nuts more. I just commented on that. So your 10 to like, if we look at the expansion for the low jack over here, you're probably going to get a hand like King 5, King 5, 9-7, 6-5, King 4 even, Queen Jack, Ace 9. Like those hands are going to be like the first ones in. You tend to add like more suited hands in first than the sort of flip side, the offsuit side. So for example, like maybe King 5 and King 4 go in and Ace 9 goes in. And before you get to Ace 8, you're going to add like maybe like 6 different suited hands before you add like 2 to the Ace offsuit Ace X. Obviously the offsuit Broadway, they're probably going to start to come in with expansions because, you know, they do have good blockers or decent blockers. But yeah, and obviously they have some playability. They can make straights, they can make like decent 2 pairs, etc. They just can be tricky to play. If we look at the hijack over here, if people are doing the things we mentioned in the previous slide too much, if they're allowing us to realize too much equity, we're going to start pretty quickly get to the point where we're putting like all of our suited kings into an opening range. Something like Ace 8, Ace 7, King 9, 10-9. Yeah, just the general theme here that you should be taking away is that when we are deeper, when we're 60 to 80 big blinds deep, it's more important that we can make nutty hands than it is than we make a top pair. If you expand to Ace 8 or Ace 7 or something like that, and you flop an ace, it can be kind of tricky to play. Whereas if you have a hand like King 3 suited, you open, you make a flush against the big blind who defended. Now you've trapped all of their worst flushes in there, and you have some pretty good implieds in your favor. And so something else I want to talk about is responding to 3-bets. That's obviously an important part of playing from the low jack and the hijack when you have a bunch of players still to act behind you in position. It's going to come up pretty often. And something that a lot of people aren't aware of is that when you are playing from those positions and you get 3-bet by an in-position player, what actually happens is there's a sizable 4-betting component as part of your counter strategy. So in terms of like why that's the case, it's just like the most efficient way to realize equity with a bunch of holdings in our range. So hands like our big pairs, like jacks through kings, ace king, these are not hands that really like the idea of seeing a flop, especially out of position. Obviously, we're going to realize a lot less equity in that case. And another sort of like perk of having an aggressive 4-bet strategy, and this does make up. It's pretty consistent that we're doing about 15 to 20% 4-betting in these spots when we're out of position. Is that it serves to keep imposition in check with their 3-bet frequency. If we are not 4-betting enough, that is going to encourage an adjustment from the imposition player that sees them 3-bet more and 3-bet more linearly, and that's going to result in them taking more money out of the or EV from the pot and from us directly, which is obviously not something we want to happen. And I just commented on that. Post-flop note, I would say, so not only do we have a sizable 4-bet component pre-flop when we get 3-bet by an imposition player, but something that happens, again, across the board, is that you end up getting post-flop in a spot where you are at a big range disadvantage and you're out of position, which is obviously just like one of the worst spots you can find yourself in poker. And as a result of this, imposition obviously executes pretty high frequency C advantage. Post-flop note, I would say, so not only do we have a sizable 4-bet component pre-flop when we get 3-bet by an imposition player, but something that happens, again, across the board, is that you end up getting post-flop in a spot where you are at a big range disadvantage and you're out of position, which is obviously just like one of the worst spots you can find yourself in poker. And as a result of this, imposition obviously executes pretty high frequency C-bet strategy. And in response, Hero actually does a lot of check raising for a couple of reasons. One, it's just the most efficient way for them to realize equity with a bunch of their like marginal holdings. The SPRs are usually shallow enough that they can just stack off with like a decent top pair. But also number two is that in a spot like that where you are at a big range disadvantage and you're out of position, you really don't want to proceed by calling a bunch of weak hands, because all you've done is weaken your range that gets to the turn in an inflated pot at a massive range disadvantage. And then you're going to have to defend even weaker again on the turn facing another bet, which is going to come pretty frequently and against a polarized range. Obviously, that's like one of the worst spots you can find yourself in poker. So what you do is implement this aggressive check raise frequency or strategy that sees the bottom of villain's C-betting range have to just bet fold their equity. You get to realize your equity with your marginal holdings, and you get to naturally strengthen your calling range that continues. So that's like a really important note. And I just commented on that. All right, so relevant adjustments. So this is going to like touch on everything mostly to do with RFI and 3-bets. These are based on like pool tendencies and mostly just pool tendencies, to be honest. All right, so when do we expand our RFI range? Button not VPIPing or 3-betting enough. Those are going to be spots where we'd like to attack by opening a bit more. Big blind folding too much to 2-bets. A 2-bet is just an open, so if the big blind is not defending adequately enough, either by 3-betting or just folding too much, we're going to start to play more hands. In terms of range contraction, this isn't as common, but range contraction is going to come up in a spot where maybe you have like a maniac or two behind you, some guy that's just going to 3-bet a lot and not, or put a lot of pressure on you, play a bunch of hands. You're not going to be able to get an open through enough. It's going to drive the bottom of your range negative. As a result of that, I think a good adjustment is to just play less hands and make more money with the hands you do play. Expanding how you defend versus a 3-bet. Overwhelmingly, that's going to happen when people 3-bet to too small of a sizing. A word of caution in regard to that is that people do 3-bet tighter than they should, even when they should be 3-betting pretty tight to start with. They still manage to 3-bet even tighter than they should, just end up with the nuts way too often. So even if they do end up 3-betting to a small size, if they are 3-betting to a small size with a range that consists of queens plus ace king, you probably still have to fold relatively often. And then finally, contracting how often you're defending versus a 3-bet. Again, that is going to specifically happen when villains are just 3-betting too narrow or too strong of a range. Even if you're getting a decent price, again, as I mentioned before, it just doesn't matter. The overwhelming factor is the composition. The range is just way too strong, and it doesn't matter the odds you're getting. You're going to be out of position, chances are, and you're just not going to be making money, even though you're getting this like immaculate price. And then finally, to conclude this video, just a word on hijack strategy versus a low jack RFI. We didn't talk about it yet. It's a pretty small VPIP, obviously. So low jack has elected to open from a spot where there's 5 players behind them still to act. A hijack has the action on them, and they still have 4 players back after them. So you end up with this really tight 3-bet, this really tight calling range. I do think that it's a reasonable adjustment to make in this exact spot at the table, to elect to just 3-bet your entire range for like a smaller size. I think it just makes it a lot easier to just keep track of the hands you're playing. And that's all I have to say about that, really. Yeah, and I think that's going to be it for early gameplay from the hijack and low jack. Next lesson, we are going to talk about the exact same thing, except for the button and cutoff. So I will see you guys then. Hey guys, welcome back to lesson number 2 of our early game module, and today we're going to be talking about cutoff and button preflop strategy. So right off the top, let's just talk about some situational differences between what we talked about last lesson, which was low jack and hijack, and cutoff button, specifically when it comes to RFI. So when we're dealing with a spot in the cutoff or button where it's been folded to us, obviously the biggest factor is that if you're open in cutoff, you only have 1 person behind you that's in position and 3 players total versus the low jack and the hijack, what they have to deal with. And then as the button, you are guaranteed to have position post flop. So obviously the button is the most profitable position at the table, and that is followed by the cutoff. And obviously the fact that you are going to have position very frequently post flop is a huge part of this. So as I mentioned, when it comes to RFI, you have less people behind to get through. You're more likely to be in position when hands go post flop. And additionally, something I didn't mention yet is that the ranges we are playing against post flop and single raise pots tend to be weaker and more capped. The reason that that's the case is because when we open a fairly wide range, our opponents are incentivized to 3-bet with their strong holdings as well as bluffs to get more money in the pot. So when they do decide to call behind, it tends to be with weaker range. And as a result, we get post flop in a spot where, we have hands like 10s plus, ace queen plus, and they have none of those in their range. Another difference that we see is that the cutoff and button end up incentivized to introduce a pretty sizable cold calling component. This makes a lot of sense again because being in position in poker is such a massive strategic advantage that this allows them to take advantage of that. So again, takes advantage of position. It maximizes win rate. It maximizes win rate in relation to a strategy where maybe you were playing strictly 3-bet or fold. Introducing a cold calling component is going to allow you to play more hands and to capture more EV. And we also see the introduction of a sizable 3-betting component when we are in the cutoff and button. And obviously that is just because we have a is a huge inherent advantage in no limit hold'em. It maximizes positional win rate over the 3-bet only strategy, which I discussed before. And in terms of like exact frequencies, it's pretty consistent that the cutoff is implementing about a 10% 3-bet frequency versus the low jack and the hijack, while the button executes about a 15% strategy versus the low jack, hijack, and cutoff in 6-max at least. But like I think you just look at those numbers now, you think about it, and my guess is that in the games you're playing, the button is not 3-betting 15% of the time versus a hijack open. I would be pretty shocked if it was much bigger than 10. And like, again, that's something you have to be cautious of because they are going to end up with the nuts a bit too frequently. In terms of the exact range you use, or like where your cold calling regions are dense in different areas of the hand grid chart, it's going to be dense, small to medium pairs, suited hands, and big offsuit holdings. And I actually have a chart coming, which is going to sort of illustrate this a bit better. Actually, it's literally the next thing. So here is sort of the way I did this was it's a bit of an aggregate of the cutoff versus the cold calling range versus the low jack and the hijack. So in this spot, anything that's in like full green here, I'm not saying you should be full weight calling it. What I'm saying is that these green hands are the densest region of calls. And what I mean by that is that on average, they were calling versus those two positions like greater than 50% of the time. So they were like mostly played as calls, but all those hands were all these hands on the screen here were also being used as 3-bets too. So don't think that they're 100% pure calls. They absolutely are being 3-bet as well. In terms of like things I would note, obviously we see queens and ace king being stripped like completely out, which makes sense. They're hands that just want to like, low jack or hijack is opened. And with hands like queens and ace king, we're like, we're pushing a ton of equity versus your range. We'd like some more money to go into the pot. So we're going to 3-bet that hand. Another thing I'd note is that ace 5 to ace 9, I did not include in here. They were called out of frequency, but they were very high frequency 3-bets. In terms of why I think this is the case, I think that a few things are happening. One, ace 5 through ace 9 can get some better hands to fold. You 3-bet the cutoff versus hijack or low jack. They should be folding ace 10 at like pure weight, which is obviously 12 combos, which is obviously pretty awesome to have happen when you have ace 7 suited. Another thing that's going to happen is they have better pair value post flop than a hand like ace 2 or ace 3, for example. In addition, you can only have so many hands in your cold calling range from the cutoff before your calling range just ends up too weak and you start incentivizing people behind a 3-bet and squeeze. Another thing I'd note about this range is that it's pretty strong, and that does make sense because the threshold for making a plus EV VPIP after the hijack or low jack have opened and you're in the cutoff is quite high. And as a result of that, we get to use some pretty strong hands in our calling range and in our 3-bet range. Something I would note is that you don't see any suited connectors from 6-5, 7-6, or 8-7 suited. They were in there at a frequency, but they were also folding, which tells me that at equilibrium, they were making no money, and which tells me that in practice, we're probably not making any money either, unless we're playing against some really weak players who just don't put enough pressure on post-flop. So I wouldn't completely write out the possibility that those are profitable VPIPs, and if you want to play them yourself as a VPIP and then sort of reference your data and see if it's actually making money, go right ahead. In terms of the button, we can see that there is an expanded value region. So while we had queens, ace, king over here in the cutoff, we've got jacks, ace, queen, ace queen suited, and ace, king offsuit for value. We see that ace 5 suited through ace 8 suited is being used as a heavy 3-bet. We see ace 9 suited now leaning towards a call, while it was mostly a 3-bet earlier. My guess is just ace 9 suited is doing a lot better versus the opening range on average. And it's also got less people behind, so it doesn't have to worry about getting knocked off its equity as much. We see the button going considerably down with king X suited. And I think this is a region that a lot of people miss. If I had to guess, most people are probably calling the button down to about king 9 or king 8. But the reality is you should be going a lot wider than you probably are. Again, when we're a little bit deeper, the SPR is going to be relatively deep post-flop as well. And having a hand that can make a nutty hand like a king high flush is obviously really good. And again, we've expanded a little bit of our range. We're now able to call down to like hands like queen 8 suited, jack 8 suited, 10 8 suited. We got the suited connectors in there. King 10 offsuit, Queen Jack offsuit. Again, I would point out that this range is like fairly strong. And again, it's just the case that with two people still live behind, the fact that we're on the button and we've only put in an ante, our threshold for making a plus EV play is significantly higher than, for example, the big blind, who's already committed a big blind. So 3-betting. This wasn't really a thing that we talked about in the low jack and hijack lesson because it wasn't really that relevant except to the hijack, and it was really small component. So 3-betting. Why do we do it? We've talked a lot about first principles in the first two modules here, or the first two lessons, sorry. Why do you think we 3-bet? And spoiler, I actually have given it away either in earlier in this lesson or the previous lesson. It's simply that it forces money into the pot with our strongest holdings. So if you think of it as, let's say we're the button and the hijack opens. The hijack is like, I have a hand that is strong enough for me to open into these 4 players behind to take a share of that pot that they think they're entitled to. When the button 3-bets, what the button is saying is that, okay, congrats, you got that really tight range here, but I've got a holding here in my hand that pushes a ton of equity versus your range and is just really strong and would benefit from getting more money into the pot. And obviously that range ends up being constructed of like those value holdings like we talked about, like 10s plus, ace, queen, king, and then it's also going to have some bluffs supplementing it. Another thing 3-betting does is it denies the option for those behind to overcall or squeeze after we have just cold called, which is obviously a great thing. You can actually really tee off on people. People do tend to call extremely capped. And if you're against someone who's opening a bit too much, and then you're against a player who's calling a very capped range, squeezing behind becomes extremely lucrative. I'd check my database if I were you, just to look into that a bit deeper. And one of two things frequently happens when we 3-bet. One thing, which is awesome, is that everyone folds and we pick up the pot uncontested. Picking up money without any resistance is super lucrative and adds a ton to our win rate in poker. And then on the flip side, the other thing that happens, probably the second, or yeah, it's pretty close probably, but the second most likely thing that happens is that everyone folds except for the opener calls, and we go post flop heads up in position with a large range advantage. Because again, remember, our opponent should be, in theory, implementing a very aggressive 4-bet strategy, which is going to strip a lot of the best hands out of that calling range. Maybe they're still hitting aces sometimes or whatever. But as a result, we're going to find ourselves, even though we're in position and we've sort of negated that range, like the advantage of position because the SPR is going to be shallower, it doesn't matter because we're pushing such a massive range advantage. And similar to our previous slide on the cold calling composition, this is the 3-bet composition or the 3-bet construction. Again, I'm not saying 3-bet all of these ranges at full weights. With the exception of the strongest value holdings, these hands are all mixing with call some of the time. But these are just like the most common, the densest 3-bets that find themselves in these ranges versus an RFI or in these positions. And again, very similar to the previous slide on the cold calling, all the bluffs, like even the weakest bluffs, are actually quite strong. I think that's the very first thing to note. And again, you're able to do that because a lot of those other hands at the bottom of the range that aren't in at any frequency are just not profitable. You can't call them. You can't 3-bet them, nothing. So, I mean, I guess you could 3-bet, but why would you 3-bet 10-5 suited when you can 3-bet King 8 suited? If you're 3-betting 10-5 suited, you're obviously just 3-betting too much. Meanwhile, a lot of these hands, they're just going to push a ton of equity. They're like good, they're easier to play. It can be a bit awkward to play a hand. I guess it's not as bad when you're going to be in position. But something else I'd note here is that these hands like King Queen, King Jack, Queen 10, they are finding themselves in the 3-bet range a little, but they are heavily biased towards calling. And I do think that a big reason that's the case is because they're not gaining enough by 3-betting. They're not getting a bunch of worse hands to fold. And they do end up with some reverse implied odds. For example, like a hand like Queen Jack or King Queen or something. Ace Queen's a pretty high frequency call, I assume, for our opponents in most spots when we 3-bet these positions. Yeah, we just end up doing a lot better versus the entire range, for one thing, than we do in a 3-bet pot. We'd rather keep our position, keep the SPR deeper with holdings like this and play against the whole range. And in addition, these hands are almost definitely continuing versus a squeeze from a player behind, so they help protect our range in that sense. And then we're going to end up in position versus that player. I'm just trying to think of like what else to note here. I'm pretty sure I already noted that this is these are relatively strong ranges for, again, obvious reasons. A lot of these hands below here, these offsuit crappy hands and these offsuit shitty suited hands, they're just not profitable to be played. There's no reason to reach for a 3-bet bluff with 9-4 suited from the cutoff when you're not V-pipping hand higher than 9-7 suited, I guess, profitably, and you can just use a much stronger holding that's going to have a lot more equity versus your opponent's continuing range, and you're going to block their continuing range, which you obviously don't do with 9-4 suited. So responding versus 3-bets, we talked about it in the prior lesson regarding it in spots where we were the low jack and hijack and we were often going to be out of position. And we talked about how Hero's optimal response in that spot when they're out of position is to implement this really high frequency 4-bet strategy, really high frequency check raise strategy on the flop, and why that's the case. When Hero's going to be in position, it's a lot different. So we have a significantly smaller 4-betting component relative to if we had been 3-bet by an in-position player. And again, I asked this question, like, why? Pause the video and think about it. So there's a couple of reasons for this. One thing that's happening is that 4-betting is going to negate our positional advantage. We're going to have a bunch of hands that, based on the price we're getting, just want to call and see a flop. After we've opened the cutoff or button, we should be facing a 3-bet range that is not just the nuts. So we should be able to profitably continue versus a given bet size with a range that's pretty wide. And because of that, it just ends up being the case that having a hand like ace queen suited or having a hand like pocket aces is at this SPR is just generally better to throw into our calling range because it does a few things. If the board is kind of messy, we can just fast play on the flop. And on the flip side, it also helps to sort of protect the fact that we were getting a good price and included a bunch of weaker hands in our range. Our range doesn't end up super capped. We still have hands that are incentivized to 4-bet, like probably pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks. Those hands are a bit more vulnerable to the 3-bet range, even though they have position. People are going to be 3-betting something like king queen or king 4 suited or something like that, and it's a win to get those hands to fold pre, and we're doing fine versus stack off range. But yeah, there's just not as many hands that are incentivized to get it in, and some of our stronger hands make more money by calling and also serve to protect a weakened calling range. I hate that. I should disclaimer: you don't do anything in poker for protection reasons. What should be happening is that our opponent should do a decent amount of bluffing, and it just ends up being, because our range is fairly wide, they should do a decent amount of bluffing post-flop, and because they're doing a lot of bluffing, it ends up being the case that hands like ace-queen and pocket aces just end up making more money in the calling range. It's not because they're serving, they do serve to protect the range, but it's a secondary thing. It's not like a primary reason for doing that. And I have a word of potential caution here regarding that low frequency 4-bet and high frequency defend. And that is that a lot of that is based on how people are playing right now. So we see a lot of 4x 3-bets out of position, 3.5x 3-bets out of position, still the odd 3x, which is just way too small. And my suspicion is that as an optimal 3-bet in my head in game theory would be larger in a spot like BB versus button, it would probably be closer to a 5x 3-bet. And obviously if that's the case, now there's more money out there for button to try to win. And in addition, our range that does continue versus that 3-bet ends up more strong and doesn't sort of get attacked as much by the big blind as a result of that. And therefore we have hands maybe ace queen suited or ace king that more often than not just decides to play for stacks in that spot rather than calling pre, because there's a lot of money out there and because they're not expecting our opponent to go ham post flop as often as they would versus our wider range that we have versus the smaller size. I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. It makes sense to me. So relevant adjustments when it comes to playing the cutoff and button early. In terms of expanding your range, when you're the cutoff, if button's cold calling too infrequently and 3-betting too infrequently, again, the button should be probably 3-betting about 15% and cold calling like at least 10 would be my guess. If they're not doing that enough, then you're going to be almost guaranteed to be in position too often post-flop, and you're going to be able to play more hands more profitably, so you should open more as the cutoff. Blinds folding too much to steal, which is a 2-bet, especially the big blind. So the big blind should be folding a combination of about 25% of the time versus cutoff and button. If they opened at 2.3x, still lots of guys way over folding their big blind. And as a result of that, ATC steal opportunities remain quite present and quite prevalent in poker, even though we are, years into the GTO era. In terms of range contraction, I don't think it's very applicable in a spot like this. Like, even if you are opening the button into a couple of maniacs that aren't going to fold enough, you're still going to be playing against guys that are playing a lot of very weak hands because you opened the button. And it's also going to be the case that you have position, so you're just going to realize more equity. I guess, like, in a dramatic sense, if someone was 3-betting like 40% of the time, maybe you could opt for like cutting the bottom of your range and doing more 2-betting to 4-bet all in if they 3-bet, stuff like this. So expanding your defense versus a 3-bet, that's going to happen generally if villain's 3-betting too small, and this does become more of a thing when you open the button and the cutoff. And the reason for that is quite simply that when you open cutoff or button, even if people don't have a really good, strong grasp of theory, they still know enough generally that they know they need to be playing more than just the nuts, 3-betting more than just the nuts versus you because they know you're opening relatively wide. But people still do 3-bet too small, and versus something like a 3x open, you're obviously going to be... there's not very many hands you're going to be folding to that size when you're 75 big blinds deep. Like, I would never fold a suited hand, for example, against like any suited hand I'd open, I would just never fold. And then finally, last point here, in terms of defending versus 3-bet, in terms of contracting what you should be continuing versus a 3-bet, versus the nittiest of nits, just fold, man. Just like if you know that they're 3-betting 5% versus your button open and they're the small blind, like, even though maybe they're giving you a bit of a price and you've got position, you should still probably find some bigger folds. I'm not saying you should fold 10-8 suited or something like that when you're going to have position, but versus a 3x 3-bet for the small blind. But, maybe if you have something like 10-3 suited or 9-4 suited or something like that, you should just be disciplined and find a fold, because it's really hard to just make money versus those really tight 3-bet ranges, especially when the SPR is going to be reasonably shallow post-flop and even when you have position. That's it for now. The next lesson, so we've already talked about the hijack and lowjack. Today we talked about the cutoff and button, and in the next lesson we are going to look exclusively at small blind play early. So I'll see you guys then. Hey guys, welcome back. So far in module number 2, we have looked at hijack and lowjack strategies as well as cutoff and button strategies. And today for module 3, naturally, we are going to look at small blind strategies. All right, so some important first principles for playing the small blind early. Again, this is just sort of like the foundations of what's happening when you're in the small blind in a sit and go 60 to 80 big blinds deep early. First thing, most important point, is the threshold for making a plus EV play is relatively low. It's the second lowest it's going to be at the table after the big blind. And as long as your hand is making more than losing 60 big blinds per 100 by playing it in whatever manner you play it, that's going to be a better option than folding that hand, which is, a low bar. And then second thing, most important thing, is that you have a small discount as a small blind. Every hand you want to enter the pot as a result of the fact that you have the small blind, which was not voluntarily put in the middle before the hand, before you got cards. And as a result of that, after the big blind, you have the best discount to enter the pot at the table.
So with those two things in mind, let's talk a bit about calling out of the small blind versus opens. So the number one characteristic or sort of like overriding element when it comes to, or consideration when it comes to calling out of the small blind, is that you are never going to close the action when you do so. And that's really important. And because as a result of the fact you're never going to close the action, the small blind's actually incentivized to execute a strategy that has this significant, more linear 3-bet component to it. And because you have this significant 3-bet component, naturally your calling range ends up getting a little capped. So you have to pay special attention to make sure that you're not like super capping yourself and making it so that, like, let's say the big blind squeezes and the opener folds, that you're just always folding in that spot. And as I noted here, it's especially versus steals for exactly the reason I mentioned, in that it increases your vulnerability to squeezes. If you think about the spot from the big blind's perspective, there's cutoff or button open for between like 35 to 65% plus of their range. Small blinds decide to call this really capped range. Basically, they've sort of contributed 2.5 big blinds to the pot, basically charity. If you 3-bet, opener's going to fold quite a bit. Small blind's always going to fold because they're so capped. And big blinds just found a really lucrative squeeze exploit spot. So you have to be very careful of that when it comes to constructing that calling range. And in terms of being responsible with constructing the range, you have to be responsible with your offsuit combos. Offsuit combos are going to add up really quickly, and the small blind cold calling component is generally not comprised of like that many hands. So if you get a little out of line with your offsuit combos, that range is going to get super weak super quick. And it is important to note that, like, yeah, you don't have to have this super balanced range where, like, let's say you call big blind squeezes, opener folds, and you have to defend half your range. Like, no, it's not like that. If you look at like Munker solutions, you'll see that the small blind is still folding to a squeeze like 65 to 70% of the time plus. The issue becomes that I think a lot of people have such weak ranges that their actual fold to squeeze in that spot as a small blind is actually in like the 80s or 90s or close to range. And like that's when we've got a big problem on our hands. And then it is worth noting that the calling range out of the small blind does tend to be pretty dense suited hands in small and medium pairs. This just makes sense intuitively to me. Small and medium pairs don't really make for very good 3-bets out of position, especially. They are good hands to reship all in with, but obviously we're too deep to do that at this point. And suited hands just realize their equity more effectively than they do relative to their offsuit counterparts. And it is worth noting at the end here that we were talking about not capping yourself or trying to make sure you don't super cap yourself in a spot versus an open. It's especially important versus steals, not as important versus the like positions, like tighter positions like the low jack, the hijack, if you're playing on like a full ring table, like EP. And that's just because naturally, as a result of the fact that your opponent has a tighter opening range, you end up having a stronger calling range. You end up having a lot more slow plays, or not slow plays, but calls with hands like pocket tens, or maybe even pocket jacks, and hands like ace queen. So yeah. All right, so we talked a bit about calling out of the small blind. Let's talk about 3-betting. Again, as I mentioned before, there is a significant 3-betting component out of the small blind. As we can see here, these are the 3-bet frequencies for the small blind versus various opens from positions we discussed in this module so far. Obviously, at 60 big blinds deep, we can see that that's going to average out to like 11 or 12% probably on average out of the small blind. This composition tends to be more linear, especially versus steals. Also talked about that. Smaller sizing allows for this. And the reason why, or not the reason, but a contributing factor to why we opt towards the linear 3-bet is that at this stack depth, it's really unappealing for villain to 4-bet. And when I say that's unappealing to 4-bet, what I'm mostly talking about is the risk reward that's going to be, or the price that's going to be presented to our opponent to do so. Like they can opt for a non-all-in sizing, but at like closer to 60 big blinds in particular, that's not going to be really super feasible or that attractive, I don't think. And going all in also isn't. So if you think about it, in a spot where cutoff opens, let's say small blind 3-bets, fairly small, there's probably between 11 and 12 big blinds out there, 11 and 13 big blinds in the pot at this point. And villain's going to have to jam 60 big blinds to pick that up. it's not that attractive of a risk reward. And as a result of what they're risking to win, small blind's just not going to have to defend a big part of the range to prevent imposition from being incentivized to start expanding their 4-betting range. We can just sort of naturally call like the sort of hands that you'd think you would call in that spot, and that's going to be sufficient. So that's another part of the reason why we're sort of like, we don't have to worry about the looming threat of being 4-bet in this spot, because it's actually not that attractive for villain. And despite the fact that we shouldn't worry about a 4-bet coming that frequently, I think that people tend to see monsters under the bed a bit. And as a result, we have my final point here, which is that my suspicion is that the average player's small blind range for 3-betting is actually a bit... I have more polar on the screen here, but it's still not like, I don't expect people are 3-betting a lot of like ace-2 offsuits or king-8 offsuit or something like that. What I basically just mean is that it's going to be missing the sizable component it should include, which is like the suited Broadway region, and a lot of hands like ace-10 suited, ace-jack suited, ace-jack offsuit or something like that. And what I think that that's going to do is result in a range that they end up 3-betting less than they should, and a range that is just a lot stronger than they should be using.